Hello. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So today we have a couple of lectures that are more technical, and one is on ecologically based pest management in urban farming, and then Paul is going to talk about resiliency to climate change and how can we make our gardens more resilient, and he's going to come up with some examples, exercises, and also with some of the summary of his own research that he did in Mexico with small farmers. So my job is to talk to you about ecologically based pest management. So when we talk about pests, pest is a definition of an organism that somehow reaches epidemic proportions. So any organism could become a pest. You know, turkeys, for example, here in the city are pests when they reach numbers like down in Giltrap, which is another field station we have, and they destroy the crops. They would be a pest. But then when they're wandering around the parks, they're not a pest. So it depends on the context. But basically, there are organisms that reach certain population densities that are damaging in certain situations. So we have occasional pests, and don't normally cause damage unless something causes the population density to increase. For example, we have a lot of pests in agriculture called secondary pest, which is an insect that is being controlled by another organism, like by another insect, predator, parasite. But suddenly you spray a pesticide to control another pest, and you kill the natural enemies of that pest that was being regulated, and that pest becomes a secondary pest. It's called a secondary outbreak. Then you have potential pests, which don't cause sufficient damage to inflict significant losses under prevailing conditions. Those are potentially pestiferous insects that are herbivores that they could feed on your lettuce, but they're not going to feed on it because actually they're controlled by natural enemies, or maybe there are other plants that they prefer of the same family that are in the environment, so they don't attack your crop. And then you have migratory pests, which are insects that sometimes move with wind, with animals, and a lot with globalization today. We have a lot of exotic pests coming in. Many of the pests actually come with people don't bring so much fruits and flowers and so on from other countries because you're not allowed to, or seeds, although some people sneak them in, and that could be a potential source of insects or diseases. But where do you think most pests, exotic pests that come constantly to California are coming in, or how are they coming in? Any guess? Huh? Aphids? No, I'm talking about how are they coming in? Huh? No, they go through quarantine. They can.
Imported food?
If it's cooked, not, and raw is inspected by USDA, so they pretty much catch it. Wind, some of them through wind, sometimes. Huh? Humans, yeah, if you bring them, unless you have insects on your body. But most people, if you bring fresh stuff, they are not going to allow to bring it into the country. It comes in the wooden materials, how you call them, the packs, where they package the stuff, the wood, the pallets. That's where it comes. Most of the pests, diseases and insects, come in pallets. Okay, so being a pest is not, as I said, an inherent property of an organism. Rather a species. It's evaluation that we do on that particular species because it's injuring or damaging our crops. So then we say, oh, this is a pest. But there's no such a thing as a pest in nature. It's a human-made term that we give to some organism that is reaching populations that is damaging a particular thing that we value, crops in this particular case, food. There are different strategies that these insects will have. And when I talk about insects, I'm talking about arthropods in general. Insects and mites, which are the main pests that we have. And there are what is called the R-selected and the K-selected species. what does that mean? It's basically a classification according to certain features that they have. The R-selected species are species that have a high reproduction rate, like aphids, for example. The aphids in the broccoli, those things are R-selected. They reproduce very, very fast. Whereas K-selected would be, for example, a worm that is on the leaves attacking one of your crops, but it doesn't reproduce that fast. It can do a lot of damage individually, but it doesn't reproduce that fast. The longevity of the R-selected species is short. Aphids live very short time, whereas a worm becomes a pupae and then becomes a butterfly and lives longer time. So they have a longer longevity. And they like disturbed habitats. They are selected. And the general strategy is by invading. So they suddenly just invade a plot, a garden. That's a strategy. So again, just to make things clear, in order for us to consider a pest, an organism a pest, a damaging stage of the organism might be present, because not all the organisms are damaging at the same stage. For example, there are insects that the larvae is the damaging causing agent, but the butterfly that comes out of the pupae after the larvae becomes a pupa is not a pest. Or you could have an immature insect that as an adult is a pest, but not as an immature. And there's many other. For example, there are certain insects that as larvae attack the roots of crops, but as adults they are predators of other insects. Okay, so it has to be occurring in the damaging stage, and in enough numbers to cause actual injury to something valued by people. So we value our lettuce, our tomatoes, and we don't want any damage on it. And once that there's a damage, the organism that is causing that damage for us is a pest. So entomologists have developed this concept of the damage level, or the economic threshold, which is basically a level that we are willing to tolerate. So for example, this level could be the number of insects per leaf. Like you say, okay, I'm going to tolerate 1 larvae or 2 larvae per leaf, or I'm going to tolerate 20 aphids per leaf or 10 aphids per leaf. It's relative. Or I'm going to tolerate 20% damage or 10% damage. Okay, so it's arbitrary. Some people we have different thresholds. Generally in agriculture, there's zero tolerance. And that's why they keep the system sprayed, because they don't want the presence of any organism, and that way they try to secure zero damage. So you can see then that when the threshold is reached, then you have to take a measure, an action. Why? Because if you don't take an action, then the losses will be higher than not taking measure. So you have to take a measure of some kind, and that we will talk about the different measures that you can take to control these insects. Now, insects that are attacking our crops is a wide variety. You have different families of insects and different orders of insects that are the most causing, that cause most of the damage. For example, you have the homopterans, which includes the aphids, the leafhoppers, the whiteflies. Then you have the Lepidoptera, which includes all the butterflies, the larvae, all the larvae that then become butterflies or moths. All of those are pestiferous. Then you have Coleoptera. You have beetles, for example, not coccinellid, chrysomellid beetles. For example, I don't know if you've seen a beetle in the garden that is green, that looks like a ladybug, but it's not a ladybug. Have you seen it? Anybody? Yeah. Okay, well, that's not a, because the red ones are beneficial. They're predators. They're coccinellids, ladybugs. But this green one is called the cucumber beetle, and it's very broad spectrum. It's a generalist. It feeds on many, many different plants. So these insects then can cause different types of damage on crops, depending on the species of plant and what they like. The consumption of plant parts. Some of them produce chemical toxins that actually will make the plant to react. Physical damage, loss of harvest quality. Some of them do cosmetic damage only. You know, sometimes that your tomato has a little mine or something and a scratch. You can eat it. There's no problem. But some people don't like that. And actually, it is estimated that about 50% of the use of pesticides in agriculture is just to maintain cosmetic quality, because people react. I don't know if you go when you go to the market. I don't know if I go to the Monterrey market and I see these people picking the things. Like, oh well, this one has a scratch. I don't like it. That's cosmetic quality. There's nothing wrong with the tomato, but that justifies a lot of spraying, because a lot of fruit gets rejected, or vegetables get rejected just because of cosmetic quality, because people didn't like them. They had a scratch, or had this, or had that, or it wasn't too long, or whatever. And that justifies a lot of the application of chemicals in agriculture. Some insects vector pathogens. They transmit viruses. For example, aphids, leafhoppers, whiteflies. And some of them produce direct contamination. For example, certain flies will lay eggs inside the fruit, and that contaminates the fruit. Not that you're going to get sick or anything, but it's contaminated. Actually, if you knew how many eggs of Drosophila are in tomato sauce, in 1 teaspoon, take a guess. Those things that they have in these McDonald's places, and you fill it up with tomato sauce, ketchup. Take a guess in 1 teaspoon how many eggs of flies you have in there. Huh? Well, that's it's around there, like 1,000. I mean, it's a lot. People don't know. It doesn't do anything to you. It's just protein, okay? But if they knew, they would not. Okay, so the injury now, there are different types of injuries. You have tissue injuries, where the leaves, or the roots, or the flowers, or the fruits, okay, that are affected by these organisms. They eat them, they make holes, they mine them, they penetrate them, they go inside the fruit and they start eating the stuff. So here, for example, you would have different types of tissue injuries that I'm going to show you to leaves next. Here you have bleaching, okay? Now, what is really interesting is that you can bring that plant to somebody supposedly as an extension agent that knows about this stuff, and you bring this plant, and the guy could say, well, this could be an insect. This could be a fungi. This could be a bacteria. This could be a nitrogen deficiency. This could be whatever, because it's very difficult to just say what this is without being in the field, because a lot of people, what they do is they go to go to the extension office of the university, and they bring the plant out of context. You have to be in the field to be looking at this, to see where to try to see if it's caused by an insect that is maybe in the soil, whatever. And this reminds me a lot, because it happens to me. I'm supposed to be an entomologist that knows about damage by insects to plants, and I know. But many times they bring the stuff to me and I don't know. And it reminds me of when you go to the doctor. You go to the doctor and the doctor's just guessing. Oh well, this thing could be a virus. At the end they finally say it's a virus because they don't know anything else. And it's the same thing with us. Unless you have then they have to do exam. Okay, take a blood test, they take this, then they can maybe understand what's going on. Same thing here. You have to send this to a lab, to a specialized lab sometimes. Sometimes you can guess, but sometimes you can't. So it's important to get very familiar with the symptoms. So this would be a leaf injury. Next. Here you have chlorosis. So for example, chlorosis is very typical that plants get yellow, and that's typical of nitrogen deficiency. It's typical, but not always. This could be a virus, that is causing the impact. Here you have this crinkling or edge effect. The edges are being consumed. Sometimes those are insects. Sometimes those are snails. It depends. This could be also a virus. A very typical of viruses also when they get kind of curly. But it could be an insect too. Next. Because you see here, you see curling, and that is typical of a virus. But in this particular case, it's not. There are certain insects that inject the toxin that causes the plant to react like that. Those are leafhoppers. Actually, you have leafhoppers in the garden. But not all of them inject these toxins. Next. Here you have leaf edge feeding, different degrees. And then this is a way in which, for example, this probably could be a larvae of a Lepidoptera. Huh? But this is also interesting because you can say, somebody can ask you, what is the degree of damage you have? So you can create a scale and say, well, I got 90% damage as opposed to 30% damage. Okay, so you can also very quickly understand the intensity and the frequency of the damage. Because, for example, you can go into a field and say, how many plants of 100 are attacked? What would that give you? The intensity or the frequency? The frequency. And then when you go and you say, instead of counting how many plants are attacked, you just take random plants and then you say, I'm going to do a scale of damage from 0 to 100%. That would give you the intensity of damage. Okay. And again, typical of, for example, chrysomelids. In the Oxford tract, there is a little flea beetle. I don't know if you've seen it jumping in sometimes on the broccoli. You'll see it. It's late in the season for it to happen in high numbers, but in the summer, those things, if you start planting those broccoli in the field, and there are flea beetles, this is what's going to happen to them. The little seedlings, they're very susceptible. But if you have wild mustard, which is very common in the Oxford tract, that weed that has a yellow flower, they prefer that because it has 50 times higher concentration of glucosinolates, which are mustard oils that these flea beetles prefer. They are both of them in the same family, but what happens is that the broccoli has less. So you can use these plants as a trap crop. Next. These are mines. This is typical what is called leaf miners, and they're lepidopteran insects. They're flies that their larvae do this type of damage. And if you have enough mines, the damage is pretty high. What would happen if you have a lot of mines in a leaf? Exactly. It affects the photosynthesis. Yeah. Next. Mottling. This is typical of viruses. This is typical of viruses where you have a little kind of curliness and then mottling of the leaves. It's typical. Next. Yes? No. Nitrogen deficiency is just chlorosis, just basically becoming very, very pale, very yellowish. Yeah. Necrosis. This is more typical of diseases. Okay? Fungi, bacteria that can cause this type of damage. Dead tissue in any pattern. Maybe in spots, maybe in the margins, maybe following the leaf vine. So it depends. You can have the three things that you see there could be different pathogens attacking the same plant because they not all of them in the same way. Next. The rolling is typical of lepidopteran insects. There are insects that are called leaf rollers. There are larvae that basically roll the plant and they make a nest in there, and then they pupate in there after they have consumed biomass. Next. Shot hole. That's another typical insects that bore in those patterns, you know. And sometimes you might not want to worry if you have. You see again here. You say, well, how much am I going to tolerate so that my yield doesn't go down? Maybe you can tolerate 50% damage. Or maybe you can tolerate 10%. We don't know how much of this is going to affect your yields. Skeletonization, this is another typical of Lepidopteran insects, larvae of different insects that cause this. And definitely you lose a lot of yield there because if it's too spread, you have no photosynthesis. Next. Spots, typical again, bacterial, fungal, viral. They're the three. The three microorganisms that cause diseases, the three cause the same kind of impact, spots. How do you know? Unless you send it to a lab so that they make the analysis and you find out what it is. Otherwise, that you can't. All I can say, well, this is a spot caused by a pathogen. Unless you're really familiar with a crop and you just work on that particular crop and you know a lot about it, then you might be able to guess. Stippling by leafhoppers. Again, insects that start sucking, and then they cause that kind of damage. And then the plant basically turns yellow, as you can see there. And what you see there, those yellow spots, those are the larvae. I'm sorry, the nymphs of the leafhoppers. But they are sucking, because the leafhoppers attack the underside of the leaves, not the top of the leaves, the underside. So you have to always turn around the. So if you see a plant like that, the first thing you want to do is, or for any plant that has any symptoms, just turn it around and see if there's something causing it. In this particular case, you can see the nymphs here. Okay? So it's very important to be observing. Hello. Next. I don't know what that is. Next. Window pawning. Okay, then you have structural. So those were leaf damage. Now structural means attacking the fruit, attacking the stems, attacking the roots. So you have galls, interference with transport, where they affect the xylem or the phloem, so that the liquids cannot move. You know, the sap cannot move in the plant. Interference with structural support, that the plants start falling down because you're affecting their skeleton. Shape, appearance, impact, abnormal growth, should die back. All these are structural type of damage. Next. So for example, these are the galls. Galls are these malformations that are used, in this particular case up there's wasps, called the synipid wasp that call that. In this case, in an olive, it's a bacteria. In this particular case, it's a rust. So it depends. I mean, the different organisms cause this. It's a reaction of the tissue. It's like a abnormal growth that starts happening in the plant as a reaction to the attack of the particular organism. Next. Here you can see the xylem being affected by borders, and on the left, you can see the larvae inside. So many times when you see a plant like this, and you're being fertilizing it, you're being giving it water, and it's still wilting, the first thing to do is pull it out, cut the stem with a knife, and see if there's something in there. And many times you'll find a larvae that is feeding on it, or sometimes the roots. You have to cut the roots and see if the organisms are in there, like larvae of weevils, for example, are typical, attacking the roots. Or if you don't see anything, if you don't see an organism, a larvae of an insect or something, you see all this stuff that is rotting. Well, that's a disease, definitely. Probably a bacteria, but could be also fungi. Then phloem. Okay, bark beetles, for example, that do galleries, especially more woody plants, and for phloem discoloration, or phloem. If you see that discoloration, also you cut the stem and you see some discoloration like that. Okay, something is happening here with the phloem. Something is affecting it. and the transport of the sap is not happening. Next. Well, the structural tissue is when you basically the plant gets broken down, bent down, like corn starts falling down, or a plant that is high, like a sunflower, bends over because it has been broken down by the attack. The stem is not firm enough and gives away. And then other types of abnormal growths, as you can see there. Next. Then roots. That's the other thing. I mean, we always tend to look at just what's above ground, and we never dig too much. It's very important to dig and get the root out, get the whole plant, and start observing if something is happening with the root. And many times you'll find that nothing is wrong above ground. The plant looks okay, but it's kind of wilting, and you want to know what's going on. Well, it could be in the roots. So you have different degrees of root worm. The root worm here, that's the diabrotica, that little green beetle that I told you about. As an adult, feeds on leaves. As a larva, feeds on the roots. And you can see a huge, damage there compared to kind of a normal plant. The amount of damage is huge. And if you have that reduction in root system, obviously your yields are going to be affected tremendously. And then you have rots of different kinds. These are typically, sometimes you take the root out, wash it a little bit to see very well, and you find the spots. That's rot, pathogens, fungi. Yeah? Yeah, well, sometimes the roots die, but they die because of when it's flooded, or sometimes too much humidity promotes fungi, promotes bacterial infections. So you want to, that's a good observation. I mean, too much water, if it's a lot of water, if it's saturated, the plant will die because of lack of oxygen. And there's no exchange of nutrients or anything. But if it's just moist, constantly moist, that could encourage diseases. Well, here in carrots, there are different organisms. For example, here you can see weevils. These are beetles that are attacking the plant. Here you can see nematodes. Nematodes are tiny worms, they're microscopic worms that actually attack the roots. And then you have on the left rotting by a pathogen. So again, 3 different organisms attacking the same crop. Yeah. It could be a bacteria, or it could be a fungi. I don't know. Next. And then the fruits. The fruits also get attacked by all kinds of things. So you have, the apple scab. This is typical. You can see it in apples. Right now, the apples are fruiting in Berkeley. What fruits are fruiting right now in Berkeley? You can go in the street and find a lot of fruit that is being thrown away and nobody eats them. What do you think is fruiting right now? Figs, one. Huh? Persimmons. God, nobody eats them and they're wonderful. What else? Apples, I said? Pears. Huh? Pears? Lime. Lemons. Opuntia, you know opuntia? Nopal, it's a cactus. Those fruits there, they're in the garden. I eat them all actually. Maybe somebody else ate them. You go up here in the Strawberry Canyon. I mean, there are hundreds. Nobody eats them. They're spiny. You have to go with gloves and get them. Yeah. We're going to talk about that. I have the cycle of the disease. It's a fungi. The codling moth is a larva that gets in, and many times you see most of the apples that you open are going to have this here in the Bay Area. The codling moth. It's basically a larva. There's a moth that comes, lays the egg, and then the eggs comes out larvae, it goes inside. And nothing can control it because it's inside, it's protected. You know, no natural enemies, no organic pesticides will be able to get that. Next. So, what is this message of trying to show you all these things? The first thing, we have to diagnose the problem. Is it really caused by a pest? By a disease, by an insect, by a nematode, by a pathogen, okay? Or is it caused by weather, frost, hail, wind, or a nutrition deficiency, or inadequate irrigation? What is it? You know, there could be many causes. So the first thing in pest management is that you really need to make sure that the problem is being caused by a pest. Otherwise, you're missing the point. You know, if it's caused by irrigation and you're trying to control the pest, well, you're not going to get too far. Next. Many symptoms look similar. You know, that's the problem. A lot of things, well, could be this, could be that, could be. The presence of the pest doesn't mean it causes the damage. That's the other thing. I mean, if you see 1 aphid or 10 aphids in a plant, as opposed to 100, it makes a difference. Okay, 100 are going to make a damage. Maybe 10 are not. So just because you see an aphid, or you see a cucumber beetle walking around, or one apple affected by the golden moth, you know, doesn't mean you have a pest problem. Then not all damage needs to be treated because there are thresholds that you establish. I have a garden, just like the many small farmers in the third world say, we share with the birds. A lot of birds that do a lot of damage sometimes to crops, you know, and they say, well, 10% is for the birds. 10% is for the insects, another 10% is for my neighbor that's probably going to come and steal some, and the other one's for God, because they also have, some of them will make ceremonies with some of the food. Just go to Dia del Muerto here, Dia de los Muertos on November 1st. Go to Fruitvale, and you'll see how people are offering to the dead, you know, a lot of fruits and things, okay? So you have thresholds. How much are you willing to keep for yourself?
I was wondering about the below ground, also like carrots. You wouldn't normally check those out until they're ready to go.
Exactly.
Like,
Well, what you will find is that if you have a stand of carrot that you planted, of course you're not going to be sampling constantly, although you could. If you have 100, you know, every week you sample 3 or 4 just to make sure that nothing's happening. But the other thing is that if you have a stand, some plants will stunt and will do worse than others. So those plants, you go and dig them out and see what's going on. So that would be the way to kind of make clear, to make sure that something is going on. Pests may be no longer present. Actually, the damage happened and then they're gone. And then you take a measure, but they're already gone. They already came, they ate, and they left. So you lose your time by doing anything. Pests may be difficult to find, especially soil-borne. You know, sometimes you don't know until the end when you harvest, because some plants even don't show symptoms, and then when you pull out, the thing is totally rotten. Symptoms may be caused by improper cultural practices also, or other factors. So again, next. So the proper identification is essential for the right control actions. Not only do you need to diagnose the problem. The way to diagnose the problem is not only by the symptoms, but what is causing the problem. Okay? So the correct identification requires identifying the pest organism, the population levels, and the beneficial levels. And the beneficial organism. For example, look at here. Here you have on a lawn 2 types of damage. This was caused by herbicide that was applied wrongly, and this is caused by grab damage. There's a grab here. You know, it's difficult to know which one is what. They're similar. When you see this bug here above, on the top, that's a beneficial insect. That's a predator. But these 2 are pests. Okay? So you might say, well, you know, these are chinch bugs, all of them, and you and it turns out that you have the geocaris, which is a predator, and you spray it because you thought it was a chinch bug, which suck, you know, the sap from the plants. So you have to identify the thing correctly, otherwise, you know, you can make mistakes. Next. Then you need to understand the life cycle. You see, we have insects that go through what is called incomplete metamorphosis or complete metamorphosis. So the incomplete are the ones that go from an egg, immature stage, and adult, and they all look the same. Okay? So for example, the geocaris is one case, the leafhoppers, the aphids, you know, they don't go through the longer cycle like where you go egg, then you have the instar, instar 2, instar 3, instar 4, the larva. When it's very young, it's called instar 2, and so on. Then they become a pupae. Then from the pupae comes the adult. That's much more complex metamorphosis. So why is it important to know the life cycle? Not only if they, but also where they spend also. Where did they lay the eggs? In the soil, in the plant, where? Where does the larvae live? In the soil or above ground? Where does the adult live? Where do they pupate? And so on and so on. Because you want to identify the weak points of the life cycle. The Achilles heel. Huh? Next. So here you can see with simple metamorphosis, the typical, the leafhoppers, the scales, the aphids, all those guys, the Homopteran insects. Basically, they go from egg to adult, but the nymphs that you can see, the mature stages are very similar to the adult. Whereas here, so you could say, well, this is a chinch bug, definitely. But this one, this caterpillar, look at how different it is from the adult. Okay, so it goes from egg, from caterpillar, pupae, and then the adult moth or butterfly. Very different. Those are more complete metamorphosis. Next. Okay, so how many species of insects do you think there are? They say it's about a billion or more. Okay? So can you imagine? You know, it's impossible. Not even the best entomologists can know them all. But let's go through some that are really common, that attack, that are common in the garden. For example, the maggots. This happens to be the apple maggot, but there are different maggots that attack different fruits. And well, you can see what they do. They lay eggs in the fruit, and then those maggots go inside, and then therefore they're very protected. Nothing can control them. Nothing. They're inside the fruit. Next. Leaf rollers, as I told you. These are Lepidopteran insects that basically what we'll do is they roll the leaf and they will cause some damage. And you can see the moth. Huh? Why this thing always sounds when I'm teaching. Okay. So you can see the eggs there. And then the larvae comes out, and then that's the moth. Next. Aphids. Aphids that attack different crops. You know, in the case of the crops that you're growing, they love all the crucifer plants, all your broccolis, your kales, your all the cruciferous plants. And in this case, this is an attacking apples. It's called the rosy apple aphid, and you can see that it rolls the leaves. So you could think from far away that it's a roller, but when you get close, you'll see all these aphids. And these aphids, you can see there, are reproducing, and many times are protected by whom? Do you know who protects the aphids? Huh? Ants. Why do they protect the aphids? The ants. The honeydew that they use for their own growth and they take it to their nest. So if you're a ladybug that loves these aphids and you come there to eat it, you're going to get attacked by the ants. and they actually throw you out. It's almost like they, boom. There are some very interesting videos actually that show how these ants act. They just basically take the guys and push them out. So if you want to control them, the first thing you have to control is the ants. So how do you control ants? Let's say you have some fruit trees in your garden, and there are ants that are protecting your aphids. How do you control them? Or how do you avoid that they climb the trees? I'm sorry? Well, if you paint the trunk, they'll go over the paint. Yeah. No, there's no bugs that eat ants. There are some, but you know, when you have thousands of ants, there's no predator that can get them. Yeah?
Or just maybe make a ring, a sticky ring.
Sticky ring, yes, that works. Sticky traps, they put that it's like a cardboard, very tight, and then you put glue around it. Or it could be grease for cars, and then the guys will not go up anymore. But then there are certain ants that are predaceous, that you want them to climb your trees because they will control pests. There's one particular genus of ants called Pheidole. And these ants are beneficial. They control insects. So what the Chinese used to do, and that's the origin of biological control of insects. I'm talking about thousands of years ago. They would find the nests of the Pheidole in the forest, bring it into the orchards, into the citrus orchards, and then these ants would climb the trees, and in order for these ants to spread throughout the grove, they would put bamboo shoots from one tree to the other, so they would go from one tree to the next. This was documented thousands of years ago, actually. Yes? Here? No, you don't want to. Well, you see, in California, we have a lot of exotic pests. So one approach to control those pests is called classical biological control. Are you a classical biocontrol person? So he can tell you what classical biocontrol is.
Oh, man. All right, so on the spot. So classical biological control is the practice of trying to reintroduce an exotic pest with a predator from its native, from its area of origin. And I work in that. I was telling Jamie about it on Friday. And so her question was something like an ant, introducing it. Ants are generally generalist predators. I'm sure there's so many species of ants. Take it with a grain of salt. So when you're trying to reintroduce a pest with a predator from its area of origin, the idea is to use a specialist predator, or I study a parasitoid. So that's a wasp that lays its eggs inside of a pest. And so when you're looking for a potential organism to introduce, you go through a series of tests where you look at potential alternative hosts that the predator might attack, and you want to see, are these species of interest? Are they endangered species? Are they of cultural significance? Are they something that could, spill out into the environment? And then as you go through the list of potential predators, you work it down, or I'll just say predators, but predators, parasitoids, fungi, nematodes, whatever your organism of interest is. You work down the list until you get the most specialized organism possible. And then it's kind of like FDA, Food and Drug Approval, where it takes several years. You have to go through testing. You have to show to a USDA committee that this is a viable option, and that the potential for it escaping out into the wild is not very high. So I hope that somewhat answered the question.
Okay, that ant, if it doesn't occur here, you don't want to introduce it because it's just generalist. It's a generalist predator and could start eating all kinds of stuff. So, but where it occurs in the tropics, okay, we'll take advantage of it. Just like spiders. Spiders are also generalist predators, and they occur here, so you want to encourage them. Biological control started here in California in the late 1800s when they brought the Rhodolia cardinalis from Australia. There was a pest that was attacking citrus called the cottony cushion scale. This is in the late 1800s, and they could not control it with the pesticide they had available at that time. So they went to the center of origin of that pest, which was Australia, and they found a beetle, a big ladybug called Rhodolia. And they brought it to California, and until today, that insect is controlling the cottony cushion scale. Mites. These guys are not insects. These are acari, and they cause a lot of problems. You have different spider mites that will be causing all kinds of problems in your leaves. They will become curly. Some of them will be like with a rust, and they will become dry, and so on and so on. But they're all, and so they're very common. But they have their predators, especially what are the name of the family of predators of mites? Okay, it'll come to me. Anyway, next. So, in order to have a pest, you have to have 3 conditions, or 4 conditions. One, that the pest is present at the right stage and in high numbers. You also have to have the environment that is conducive, that is obviously favorable to the pest in terms of temperature, humidity, and so on. Then you have to have a crop that is susceptible at the growth stage, because not all the plants are susceptible in all the stages of its growth. So it has to be susceptible at the stage that is susceptible, in that phenological stage. And obviously there has to be enough time for the development of the process. So what people do in order to deal with pests in a holistic way, they talk about the concept of integrated pest management, where they determine the thresholds of the pest, and if that threshold is surpassed, then they take action. But unfortunately, integrated pest management, although it became at the beginning kind of a holistic approach to pest management, it became intelligent pesticide management, because they always started using pesticide. That's why we talk about ecologically based pest management rather than integrated pest management. So what are the strategies that you need to take? Some of the considerations that you need to take when you're doing an ecologically based pest management approach. The first thing is to plan ahead, anticipate, take a design approach to your garden. You have to have diversity. You don't want to mix crops that are related botanically close to each other, because they're gonna, if one pest comes to one, it will go to the next because they're botanically related. All those things that we've been talking about. Prevent as many problems as possible. Build resilience into the system. One way to build resilience into the system is by trying to enhance the conditions of natural enemies. Yes?
So just on the design part, are there any rules of thumb about how far different pests can spread?
Well, a lot of the pests can spread, several meters. So what you want, if you have a small garden, you might not want to have plants that are related botanically in the first place. But if you do, then maybe you want to consider having a high density of a tall crop that would kind of create a barrier from one plant to go to the next that is related botanically, because in the middle there's a barrier of corn that is very thick or something. Prevent as many problems as possible. Build resilience, that is, give opportunity to beneficial insects to thrive. And we'll talk about how we do that. Monitor plants and pests on a regular basis. Constant monitoring, observation, constant observation. Because the problems that I identify early are easier to solve early, just like in our health, The sooner you diagnose your problem, the better you are. Use least toxic methods first, because you want to preserve the beneficial insects and microbes as much as possible. in order to maintain the system integrity. Next. Be prepared by knowing which insects are likely to show up. Okay, well, how do you do that? If you are somebody that is growing different crops, tomatoes and lettuce and broccoli, there are always neighbors, other farmers in the area, urban farmers. You go and visit them and say, what kind of problems do you have? Let's say that you're a new farmer that are coming to the Bay Area and you want to do a garden here. You want to get familiar. Well, one way is the internet. You can look at that, but you can also go and talk to farmers. And they say, oh, no, we get attacked by this and that. Okay, well, you're probably going to get that too. Know something about the pest life cycle once you know what it is, when it shows up, where it comes from, and scout regularly. That is, observe regularly. Next. Know the critical thresholds. So you establish your thresholds. That is, I'm willing to support 10% damage in my tomatoes or whatever. Use all the preventative measures that are available and practical. And if using pesticides, which could be botanical insecticides, not chemical, use the ones that will have the least impact on you, the non-target organisms, especially the beneficials, your neighbors, and the bees. Next. So one practice that we use a lot in the garden is cultural control. Part of the ecologically based pest management approach is basically cultural control, biological control. So the first one, the cultural control, is a set of agronomic practices that are designed to optimize the growing conditions for the crop and create so that the crop grows well and create unfavorable conditions for the pest, as well as creating favorable conditions for the natural enemies of the pest. One favorable condition for the natural enemies of the pest is usually having pollen and nectar, so in the form of flowers that attracts the beneficials because they require pollen and nectar for their optimal fecundity and longevity. Next. So there's a bunch of different practices. Sanitation, destruction of alternate hosts. For example, sanitation means that you get rid of all the disease stuff that you find, fruits or leaves or stems, burn them or compost them. Destruction of alternate hosts, a weed, for example, that has aphids that maybe has a virus that will be transmitted, well, get rid of that. Habitat modification, host resistant, that means plants that are genetically resistant, that have resistance to the pest. Crop rotation, intercropping, etc., etc. Next. The most common ones is soil preparation, plant selection. You want to use the varieties that are more resistant. You want to do rotations. You can alter the planting dates. You can plant early, you can plant late in order to avoid the pest. You can do interplantings, or you can use trap crops. That is, crops that you plant first and all the pests go to that, and then you get rid of the pests that went to those plants, and then you plant your the crop that you want. Next. So some specific methods. This is like a semester of pest management. This could be a whole semester, which I actually used to give many years ago. The first thing is pest-free planting. Assure plants are not infected. So when you buy them or you grow them in the greenhouse, make sure that there's no pests or diseases in the seedlings that you're going to bring to the field, because that's the source. The crop rotation, plant a different crop every year to minimize adaptation of pests. That is, that are not botanically related. So don't follow crucifera with crucifers or nightshades with nightshade family plants like potatoes and tomatoes and things like that. Don't follow the same family. Cover plants with materials to block the pests from the plants. For example, many people use nets. It's a way to avoid, it's a physical barrier. Trapping, attract and trap the pests to physically reduce their population in the affected area. As I said, wild mustards are a great trap crop for flea beetles here in this area. Natural enemies, introduce predators and parasitoids that will feed on the insects. You actually can buy these beneficial insects and release them in the environment, release them in your garden. But if you don't create the conditions for them to stay, they will go. So you have to create a habitat management approach which provides the conditions for naturally occurring beneficials to thrive. That is that they stay. And why do they stay? Because you provide habitat and alternative food, which is flowers. Not all the flowers, but composite and umbelliferae. Okay? Coriander, for example, is a nice flower that attracts beneficial insects. Wild carrot flowers. Next. A healthy soil encourages healthy and stressed plants. So the proper pH and the proper fertilization with organic material is very important to maintain a healthy plant. Actually, the organic farmers say healthy soil, healthy plants. Healthy plants, healthy people. Healthy people, healthy planet. Next. So you can use 3 approaches. The one that we like to recommend and that we should be doing if we're really taking an ecologically based pest management approach would be a preventive approach, okay, where we prevent the problem by using resistant or tolerant crops or encouraging beneficial insects to the area. The moderate one is that you do some action. And the third one, the system approach, is the active one, where you hit the thing with a hammer, pesticides, botanical pesticides, because we don't recommend insecticides, chemical insecticides in this class, because we want to promote an organic approach. But there are people that use botanical insecticides. Next. So for example, the botanical insecticides are occurring in plants. They are naturally occurring chemicals that are extracted from plants. And some examples, next. For example, are you familiar with this, the neem tree? Has anybody heard of the neem tree? It's a tree originally from India that can grow here, actually grows here in California too. And it's a Meliacea. Next. And the active ingredient is azadirachtin, okay? It's a repellent, growth regulator, anti-oviposition, reduces adult fecundity and eggs vitality. And the mode of action is through contact and ingestion. But if it's through contact, then when you spray that stuff, you could be affecting beneficial insects too. Any contact, it doesn't matter whether it's botanical or not, you know, if it affects by contact, it will affect beneficial insects too. Next. Rotenone. This is another one that comes from all these plants, especially derris and for Tephrosia. They're pretty heavy duty. Next. The rotenone is an isoflavonoid, an alkaloid, that basically what it does interfere with the respiration and with the peripheral nervous system, mainly by contact. Again, you spray rotenone and you have beneficial ladybugs flying around, they're going to get killed. So you have to be very selective with this. It's not because they are natural, you know, from plants, you know, it's that they're good. Next. Pyrethrins. This is another one from the chrysanthemum. They sell them in the stores. It has been already synthesized. There are synthetic pyrethrins available. This is an extract from the flowers. The main ingredient is pyrethrin 1. Contact again. Mechanism of action acts on the peripheral and central nervous system, causing an immediate insect paralysis. Again, contact insecticide. So you have to be very careful with this approach of, you know, like, oh, well, what do you have? These aphids, you know. Well, let's use a botanical. We're organic. It's allowed. You go in, you spray this stuff, you kill the aphids, you kill the beneficials. Next week, you have mites attacking your crop. Why? Because you got rid of all the predators of those mites. So you create secondary pest outbreaks. And if you keep spraying the thing constantly, what happens? Again and again and again and again and again. When you take antibiotic, what happens? Resistance. Yeah, just like insects become resistant to chemical insecticide, they become resistant to botanical insecticides. The same problem. So this is the last resort that you want to take. Okay? Always prevention. Next. So IPM involves identifying, monitoring pests and natural enemies, understanding the biological and environmental factors that affect the abundance and distribution of the pests and the natural enemies, tolerating higher levels of secondary pests, using treatment threshold, knowing efficacy of the control tactics, evaluating the effectiveness, And you have to also have a flexibility to change the approach. Next. So one thing is to record and evaluate results. Always take notes. Have a field manual where you put the date and say, today I applied this, I did this, and then evaluate. Oh, 2 weeks later I found that it worked. I did this and my aphid population went down. So know what worked and what didn't work. Some aspects may be, or some tactics may be slow in result. That doesn't mean that they don't work. They work in the long term, so you have to be patient. Your time horizon cannot be like 1 week. Did it work? No. Maybe a month, 2 months. See what happens. Might be ineffective or damaging to the target crop, the tactic that you use. Yeah, I killed the insect, but also affected my crop, affected my beneficials. And use the gained knowledge in future planning. You're learning. Your garden is a learning laboratory where you're learning. You're manipulating it. You're fertilizing. You're irrigating. You're combining crops of different kinds. You have to learn from it. That's why you're measuring yields, for example. That's an indicator. Okay, next. You know what? When I'm giving class, I don't like people in the internet or in looking at other things, because if you don't want to listen to what I'm saying, you can go out. Okay? Because there's like 200 people of color that would like to be here, but they can't be here. Do you know that? Okay, good. Another tactic is biological control. Periodic mass releases from cultures. You can actually buy the beneficials and release them. But as I said, the best thing is to provide the environment so that the beneficials stay in the field. So you have to recognize the naturally occurring organisms that are present in the field so that you can encourage them. You have to conserve them. And obviously, you have to avoid any chemicals, including botanicals, that could otherwise eliminate them. Next. So here you have, for example, one beneficial insect called, it's a Dicopotidae. It's a long-legged fly. It's a metallic green fly that is flying around, eating leafhoppers. Very effective. Next. This is the lacewing, the larvae, that is also a general predator that is very common in the garden too. Next. Here's the geocaris, the big-eyed bug that I show you that you could confuse with a chinch bug. Very important predator. Next. These are row beetles that exist in the ground, and you can encourage them. Row beetles and ground beetles live on the ground, and you can encourage them with mulching, and they kill all kinds of insects on the ground. And at night, they climb the plants. You don't see them during the day. At night, they climb the plants, just like the spiders do. Next. Here's the spiders. There's two strategies. The one is that they have the nets, and they capture all kinds of things, even beneficial insects. And the other ones that are the jumping spiders, for example, or the wolf spiders that are present on the ground. You can encourage them with mulching. And these guys are much more effective predators than ladybugs or other insect predators because they kill more than what they eat. They manipulate prey. I don't like this one, and they throw it away. But they killed it already. So they kill more than what they eat, and they're very important general predators. Very, very underestimated, very understudied in gardens and in agriculture in general. These are the parasitoids that Jeremy was talking about. Insects that lay eggs. For example, this parasitoid is in the garden, the Aretelia, that puts an egg inside the aphid, as you can see there. Next. And then the aphid will turn into mummies. And here you can see the exit rows, the exit holes. From there came out an adult, another wasp that is going to go, if she's a female, is going to go and lay more eggs. Next. Some of them attack the larvae at different instars. So sometimes they attack, but too late, because the larvae already did the damage. So you want larvae, parasitoids that attack the first or second instar when they're early, okay? Because you don't want the larvae to continue eating. Next. Look at this one, attacked by this tremendous combination of wasp larvae. These are all larvae of hymenopteran insects that are attacking and eating the thing. Next. Oh, look at that one. Full of pupae. And you know, sometimes you see them like that, and that's just too late. That's a tomato hornworm. It's too late. The guy ate a lot. It already did a lot of damage. It's going to get its punishment, but kind of late. Next. Then you have diseases, just like we get viruses and bacteria and stuff. These guys get them too. That's a virus attacking larvae of insects. And actually, in Brazil, many, many years ago, then it was prohibited, although some farmers still do it, and you can do it. I don't see the problem. You take these larvae that are diseased, put them in a blender. Don't tell your parents that you're doing this, or your wife, or whatever. Then that liquid, you filter it. No, it's true. You filter the thing and dissolve it in water, and then you go and spray it around. And you kill a bunch of insects out there. Many of these larvae, you have a big attack. They did it for many, many years until it was forbidden, not because of sanitary reasons or health reasons, it's because it actually became commercial product. But you can still do it. Next. Fungi. Different fungi, and you can actually reproduce this fungi not the way I did it, but in artisanal ways. In Cuba, they do this a lot. They reproduce them, and then they distribute them. They reproduce them in rice husks. Actually, you have this rice husk full of the fungi hyphae, and then distribute it in the field. Next. Look at this one. This is a very typical. You can buy this one, the milky disease, and then spray it if you have these guys in the soil that are attacking your roots, and then they get like that. You know, they get disease and they bloat it and they explode. Next. So there's a lot of beneficial insects out there that you can buy. If you go to a website called Rincon by Tova, which is probably the biggest insectary in California, you're going to find lists of insects, and then they ship them to you. And then you release them in your garden. But you have to create the conditions for them to stay. Next.
Sorry, is there anyone who will sell you diseased insects?
Yeah. No, not diseased insects, but the inoculum, yes. You can buy Bacillus thuringiensis. You can buy the diseases. Actually, in Rincon by Tova, they'll sell you diseases. But all these beneficials, when you release them in the field, you have to create a condition for them to stay. Otherwise, you have to be releasing them year after year. One way to do it, provide pollen and nectar. Next. And so here we have just a little design to show you. We have buckwheat, surrounding the broccoli. That could be an interesting case, to provide habitat for the beneficials to stay in the field. Next. Or you can have in a bigger garden or bigger field, for example, Lobularia maritima. This is a lysum, that attracts a lot of beneficial insects, especially syrphid flies that look like bees, but the larvae attack the aphids. Next. Flowers of different kinds, cosmos and things like that around your fields, because the beneficials will need the pollen and nectar to reproduce and to have optimal fecundity and longevity, and then they move into the system. But they move a certain distance, so you need to calculate when are you going to put the next row of flowers. Next. Strawberries surrounded by buckwheat. Next. And then one approach is to make the habitat favorable to the beneficial insects, and the other one is to make the habitat not attractive to the pest. So for example, here, this we saw in Costa Rica. There's an area in Costa Rica where in most Central America, you cannot grow tomatoes because they get attacked by whiteflies that transmit viruses, and they spray the hell out of them. All the tomatoes that you find coming from Mexico, heavy loads. Anyway, so these farmers planted tomatoes. You think, well, where's the tomato? You know? Well, they are there. Next. They are hidden among the cilantro. Why would they do that? Yeah. It didn't repel the pest, but the insects, how did the insects get, you know, I'm a pest and I see a plant. How am I going to be attracted to that plant? What kind of, the color is one, and the odor, the smell, is masks. It masks the odor, but also masks, you see, one thing is to grow tomato on a bare soil, because the reflection of the light is very different if you have a green cover. If you have a brown soil versus a green cover, your reflection is going to be very different. So the insects catch that, and they don't like it. So they get confused. And then after that, when the tomato reaches a certain stage, they harvest the cilantro, and they leave the tomato, and then maybe they leave one cilantro between each tomato, because the cilantro will go to flower, and then will attract beneficial insects, because there are other pests that come later to attack the fruits, like all the worms. And then you have beneficial insects in place already because the flowers are present. Yeah?
How does that affect the yield because you have all these other plants?
Yeah, the yield is a little bit lower than conventional, that is with pesticides, but the cost of production is much higher with conventional. So at the end, you get better yields, but you get more income with this system. And besides, all the health benefits and all that for not, you know, using so much chemicals. Next. Okay. How much time do you need? Huh? Okay. So keep going. In terms of diseases, again, there's a variety. I've been talking about insects in general, but the other major group are diseases. Fungi, bacteria, viruses, you know, that cause rust, galls, fruit rots, cankers, leaf spots, blights, mildew, you name it. Okay, again, the symptoms are many. We need to know which is the one that is causing the problem. So the fungi, basically what they do is they produce spores, and then after that, the structure starts developing with this hypha, that is the ones that penetrate the tissue. Okay? So when you leave your cheese and you see it all, you know, full of stuff like that, you know, after a week, green and all that, well, that's hyphae. So here's the powdery mildew caused by this disease. Next. And here you can see the cycle. It's very similar to the one that the apple scab. Very similar cycle. Okay? So you usually want to understand the cycle in order to understand, you know, where it's coming from and how are you going to stop the cycle. Next. Here you have a cucumber affected by a fungi. Next. Fusarium. That's another fungi that attacks crops, you know, and basically decimates watermelons in this case. Next. And again, you have to have the environment that is favorable, the host that is susceptible, and the pathogen that is virulent in order for you to have a disease. Next. So there are many, many practices, just like with the case of insects, so I'm not going to go over them again. Next. But one of the things that is very important is to make sure that you use free disease-free plants. And that has to be, if you're growing them in your greenhouse or if you're buying them, you have to make sure that they're disease-free. Because if you bring them with the disease, then you're going to have epidemics. And then you don't want to plant similar crops in successive years because that increases pest problems, as you know. You know, if you grow tomato after tomato after tomato, you are basically creating the conditions for a disease to spread. Next. And then I think we went through crop rotation already. And I think next I taught you about the advantages of having these different families that are going to be alternating. Next. Next. And there's the thing called the return time. You remember we talked about this, did we? Okay. So basically what you do next is you calculate, let's say that this is your garden and you have the number of beds is 48 beds. Then you group, the different families, and then you add them. For example, how many lettuce family? We have 6. Of the lily family, we have 12. Of the nightshade family, we have 16. Of the legume family, we have 8 rows, okay? So in order for you to calculate the minimum time of return, that means that you don't want to come back to that piece of land where you planted the nightshade family. What you do is you divide 48 by 16. Next. Yeah.
On the last slide,
Yes?
what's a cucurbit?
Cucurbit is the squash family. So this is the family, and this is the species. So you can see here that onion, leek, and garlic belong to the same family. Tomato, potato, peppers belong to the same family. So you group them. So now I want to find out what is the minimal return time. When should I come back where I'm growing tomatoes in order to avoid diseases in the soil? Next. So you can see the most prevalent crop family is the nightshade with 16 of the 48 beds. The average return time for nightshades is 48 divided by 16, and that's 3. You see 14 divided by 16 is 3. You really need 4. That's the minimum return time usually that you want to have, 4. So what does that mean? You have too many rows of nightshade. So you have to reduce the number of rows in order to have more time to come back. That's the way you calculate this. It's very simple. I can send this to you by, there's a whole leaflet that explains this system. Next. The same thing, we can use the prevention by using resistant varieties, do rotation, apply compost, and so on. Or if we have active, which, is pretty aggressive and can cause problems, secondary problems. Next. The main thing here is that we want to increase the soil organic matter in the soil. And we have talked about this because associated with that organic matter, then you create these food webs that are very complex, next, especially made up of organisms like these ones here. Streptomycetes, Pseudomonas, Gliocadium, Trichoderma. These are all antagonists that are beneficial microbes that are stimulated by organic matter that will kill the bad guys, okay? Just like insects have enemies, pathogens have enemies. So Trichoderma, you can buy Trichoderma, you can buy these guys also. They're called antagonists, not natural enemies in the case of insects. Next. And then there is another thing that you encourage with organic matter, which are mycorrhiza. Mycorrhiza are these fungi that grow in the soil, and they colonize the roots of the crops. Next. Next. Well, here I'm just showing the case of, this is a plant that was protected with trichoderma. Again, and this one's with a chemical fungicide. You can see that this plant was protected much more from the disease that occurs in the soil. Next. And this is the way it works. It's called antibiosis. So you can see you have the trichoderma fungi, and you have the fusarium, and then they start developing, and this guy basically grows and engulfs it. It eats it up through a chemical reaction called antibiosis. It's like an antibiotic, basically. Next. Next. So when you start using organic matter, the root system is here. Next. But all the stuff that is associated with the root, all this is mycorrhiza. These are hyphae of the fungi that colonizes the root. Next. But this is not a pathogen, you see? What it does, it basically starts colonizing the root and has a lot of beneficial effects for the plant. This is symbiosis, okay? Just like you have in the beans, you have the nitrogen-fixing bacteria, the rhizobium, which is a beneficial interaction. These fungi do the same thing, but they don't fix nitrogen. What they do next, well, here you can see again how the thing happens. Next. These are the effects that the mycorrhiza have. One of them is that they increase the tolerance to root pathogens because they cover the plant And so the hive of the pathogens cannot penetrate the roots. But they also increase the mobilization and transfer of nutrients, especially phosphorus, copper, zinc, etc. Next. So here's again the website, the food web. Next. And this is another much more complex food web. So you can see that organic matter is at the center of all these very complex food webs. The more complex your food webs, the less chances are for pathogens to affect your roots in your system. And here's characteristics of a healthy soil food web. 600 million bacterial, this is per gram of soil, huh? Per gram of soil. It's amazing. 600 million bacterial individuals, about 15 to 20,000 bacterial species, 150 to 300 meters of fungal biomass, 10,000 protozoa, 20 to 30 beneficial nematodes that feed on bacteria and fungi, and 200,000 arthropods per square meter in that particular case, like different insects that are important, especially Collembola. All right? Okay. Whew. That was like a semester of pest management, but basically those are the principles. And what we'll do is we'll probably put this presentation in like a PDF and then hang it in the web for you guys. Maybe they need. Do you have any questions? Everything is clear, like petroleum? Yes?
Just like the overall theme of the lecture, like, is pest management seen not as like, or pests not as a problem, but that has a solution, but more as like the process of dealing with them?
Yeah. The pest is an organism that will become a pest because it reaches conditions because there are conditions in the garden that allows it to build its population and then damage and eat the crop, the herbivores that are present. So we want to avoid those conditions. We want to make a garden that on the one side promotes the growth of the plant because the healthy plant is more resistant, but at the same time discourages conditions that would favor the epidemics of a particular herbivore, and it will create conditions for natural enemies, beneficial insects, or antagonists against the diseases that are going to suppress the growth of that. So basically it takes a lot of ecological knowledge. And ecological knowledge is not only something that you learn here in class and you read in books. Ecological knowledge comes from interacting with your garden, observing. That's how traditional farmers did it. You know, they never went to university, and they never took agroecology, they never took urban farming. And you go into their systems, and they're very complex systems, and they are managing things correctly. You know, and that's what we need to do. You need to learn. That's why in some slides somewhere I said, always observe and always learn from what you're observing. And for that, you have to take notes. Oh, I did this association one time of this and this, and it turned out that in that particular bed, I didn't have the pest problem, but when I did this other association, I did. Well, that's an observation. Now you want to figure out why. Why in this one where you have this association, you have the pest, and when you have this association, you don't have the pest. Okay, that takes you to the next step. Now you want to know why. The first thing is you observe the impact, the effect. The second one, you want to know why. What are the mechanisms that are explaining what's going on? Okay? And then from that, you gain knowledge, and that knowledge, you take it into the design. The design of a garden that is going to be productive, that is going to be resilient, and that's going to be preventive of problems rather than reactive. Because when you react, no matter how natural you want to be with particular botanical insecticides, as I explained, you can undermine everything that you did with your preventive management by spraying something like nicotine or rotenone or something. Okay? So that's kind of the message of the whole thing. It's easy to say, but there's no way around. One is read books, look at the internet, get as much information as you want, but the other thing is to go and do it. And you have had that experience a little bit since you're gardening. You're doing raised beds, you know, and that's why we feel that this class has to have this practical component. Otherwise, just by looking at slides, you're not going to learn much. It has to be complemented by practical activity. So we're going to have a break of about, what, 5 minutes?
I didn't get cups for everybody because I didn't think everybody would actually want it. But there's juice that was made from the greens that were harvested from the Oxford tract. So help yourselves.
And I put a little diseased larvae in there.
We'll get back together in about 5 minutes. So we're gonna get started again.
And then
Oh, really?
yeah,
Oh,
I've been here.
you can email Jeremy.
Okay.
Just let him know. Yeah. So I'm going to get started. So Brian helped prepare the vegetable juice, and Noah too, right? Okay, I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that that it is approaching the end of the semester, so November 26th is the deadline to turn in your reports for the community projects and crop plans. It's not that far away, so I just wanted to put that out there. And we're kind of shifting away from anything, practical about gardening, and we're in lecture at least, and we're covering a lot more of the social stuff in the last portion of the class. So right now I'm going to talk about resilience and planning for climate change, and next week we'll have a discussion about food justice, local markets, things of that nature, and the week after that we'll be talking about eco-literacy, education, and in school gardens. And then the final week of lecture is, more of like a policy discussion with people who are part of food councils and city governments and stuff like that. So it's going to be a fun ending to the semester. Yeah?
Just to clarify, so you said that the community projects and the crop plans are both due at the same time?
Yeah, they're both due on the same day at the same time.
Okay.
November 26th at 4 p.m. And please post them to bSpace and bring a hard copy to us so that we can grade it and give it back to you with comments. Are there any other questions about that? We have to decide on, about presentations. They're going to be in the last 3 class periods, and we haven't really thought about it yet. I suppose if people we'll probably just assign randomly different periods, and if there's an issue, then we can resolve it. That's a good point. We should get on that. And we should also be posting. We have to figure out how to get your grades to you before the end of the semester, so that you'll have a little bit of a heads up, and you can give us feedback too if there are mistakes. So we're going to work on that as well in the next couple of weeks. Okay, so unfortunately, I hate the layout of this projector because I can't actually see the slides, but maybe it's a good thing. So I'm going to start out by talking about resilience and food security, just conceptually, and then I'm going to talk about methods that are used most commonly in planning that involve like what I'm calling high technology, so GIS and modeling and things like that. And then the last part of the lecture is going to be about research that I do in Mexico that's more of a low technology approach to something similar. And hopefully there'll be enough time for us all to do an activity together towards the end. So I'm going to try to leave half an hour at least at the end so that we can do kind of something a little bit more interactive. So I'm discussing the reading from this week, both the optional and required, and also then part of my research that's not published yet but will be soon. So starting with resilience, do people have an idea of what resilience is, or does anyone want to, has anybody heard of resilience? Yeah. Endurance. So meaning,
Like being able to render for a long time, like being able to like say like handle cold climates better.
okay, endurance. That's one maybe one answer. Yeah.
Resistance to change and the ability to recover from change.
Okay, resistance from change and the ability to recover. That's getting closer.
Well, the way that you characterize it on the slide is the ability to withstand disturbances.
So the ability to withstand disturbances.
Right.
Okay. So what would be some examples?
Temperature fluctuations that are abnormal, unusual amounts of rain or a lack of rain.
Okay. Yeah, and it's used, so basically it's being able to recover from some sort of disturbance and come back to more or less the same state that you were in before the disturbance occurred. There can be change in the way the system is structured, but some of the fundamental characteristics are the same. It comes out of ecology, and it's a bit, I might say, controversial or problematic. It's used quite commonly in a lot of different disciplines now, and in common language, it's become a word that people actually use. A lot of NGOs and activists use the word, and so it's not void of critique. There are issues of resilience at what scale, even what the concept of a system is problematic when you're talking about social systems and the people and movement of people and resources. So for now, I'm using the word resilience. Probably when I publish my work, I'm going to drop it completely, but it was on the syllabus, so I'm bringing it up now. And you will hear it used in a lot of contexts. So one way to view it is through the lens of sovereignty. And we, in the agroecological world, we kind of prioritize local sovereignty of people to make food choices and also control their the energetic sources they use to drive their lives and the technology they choose to employ when they're, for example, growing food. So from an agroecological perspective, you might say that resilience comes out of having that ability to kind of define your own food, energetic, and technological trajectory. The next kind of definition slide is about food security, and this is from the reading. It's quoting FAO 1996. So, when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. So it's a pretty basic, definition of just having access to food at all times and being able to have some choice in food preferences. So this is an important concept when we're discussing urban settings, because oftentimes a lot of people in urban settings are actually food insecure, and that might surprise some people, but it's actually the case that a lot of families don't have access to food, whether it be because of distance to a supermarket or the economic cost of accessing food. So even in places that are very abundant, like the United States, we still have huge problems with food access. One way to study the issue of food security is by looking at the food chain, what's called the food chain. And so if you break down the steps from producing food all the way to consuming it, and then even what happens after people consume the food, the waste products, the byproducts, all those things, that's considered kind of a food chain approach to studying food security. And what we might achieve out of breaking what's considered the farm to, what is it called? Table, what is it? Farm to fork. That's kind of what this is that we get, we isolate activities and interactions that are happening both in the physical realm and also in the social realm at every stage that might be impacting food security. And then you can start to think about ways that some sort of change or some sort of plan, policy might affect this very complex set of steps, right? Because if you think of all the actors that are involved in every step of the process, there's, especially in our current model of food production, there are just, many intermediaries between what the production system and the end consumer, right? Any questions about these two slides before I go on? Okay. So this article proposes a couple agendas. I'm not actually going to skip right over that and go on to the next thing. Okay, so what do we know about the impacts of climate change and how that's going to affect us? This is a summary, I'm not even going into the science of climate change. I'm assuming that you might hear about that in other classes or have learned about it elsewhere. But these are some of the impacts on development on human development that are expected from climate change. So climate change is going to have effects on agricultural production due to changes in availability of water, climate, temperature. There's going to be greater water stress and also rising sea levels. So different, depending on where people live, there could be different kinds of impacts from climate change. And then the biodiversity in our environment is also going to be affected. So species are going to either move or perish, And then in terms of human health, you might have impacts where increased temperatures actually, or extreme events make it more likely for there to be diseases or problems like the flu might become more prevalent, or certain other things that happen cyclically might become more prevalent. And then we have the case of these extreme events that really affect humans, like these intense storms that are becoming more and more frequent. And then in terms of specifically on food production, focusing a little bit more, we're going to see a change in rainfall and temperature, increased risk of flood, increased risk of water shortages, resulting in more malnutrition and hunger, reduced biodiversity, reduced crop productivity. So it doesn't look very promising, right, for us, unfortunately. And on top of that, speaking now more to the urban setting, the article we read for this week mentioned that urban environments are actually more susceptible or more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of a couple of factors. One is just, what I thought was very interesting about this article is that they say that there's an actual urban heat island effect, which basically there's a reduced airflow through cities because of the physical structure of cities. You end up with a retention of heat in the concrete that is typically used in cities. And then you end up with this combined effect of air pollution with the changes in climate, which could have even more drastic effects on people's health. So that's to say, surprisingly, people in the city may actually feel the direct effects of climate change more than people who are in rural places. So what do they propose to do about it? Well, they're calling for green spaces, which I would kind of use as to encompass urban agriculture as within this idea of increasing green spaces, right? So the advantages of having open or green spaces is that you have temporary water storage, so if there's a flood, there's somewhere for the water to go. It's not going to have as much of an impact. And then it also releases that water slowly rather than the kind of high-rise, high-fall pattern we see in a lot of concrete cities, right? And then also we have the absorption of pollutants in the urban setting and releases of oxygen, both of which are kind of taking care of this synergistic effect here that they mentioned. So does that make sense? Okay. So in terms of planning for this, they suggest a couple things. Migration corridors, thinking about spatial distances to drainages, so having like enough space to both account for flooding as well as enough green space to absorb water that will reduce the effects of drought. So basically ensuring that people's water sources are having enough infiltration into them, whether if they're underground. And then thinking about floodplains. So it kind of is related to the point before that, but a lot of people tend to settle in floodplains because it's more affordable to build there. Traditionally, that's where agriculture was practiced, and people tended to follow settling wherever agriculture was possible. So it's an unfortunate correlation that we have this human settlement in a place that naturally wants to flood, right? So their proposal is more of this high-tech approach to planning, which if you pick up any climate change plan for anywhere in California, especially on the coasts, I'm sure San Francisco has one, I'm sure Berkeley has one. I think they're working on one and we might hear about it. I know Santa Cruz has one where I'm from. And basically they do this kind of modeling which tries to optimize. Basically it looks at the probability of, for example, in this case, this reading was about flooding. So the probability of a flood occurring in any given place, given the projected changes in climate, and then estimating the economic damage that would impact that area if flooding did occur. And if you put that in a GIS system, what you can end up seeing are, how different policy changes would change the actual impact on property, for example. Like if you had an area that was high probability of flooding and you plan to do this really expensive development project there, you may want to rethink that, right? Because that whole project could be potentially destroyed, or it would be even more expensive to try to protect that area in the future from flooding, right? Whereas if you maintain that space in a relatively open, low monetary, input kind of system like agriculture or some other use, then you could maybe more judiciously manage the landscape. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm not an expert in this, but basically it involves, modeling, optimization problems, mathematical optimizations. You take into consideration economics and values, and try to imagine through projections that are developed by, climatologists for what future scenarios may look like for a particular region. So this is kind of the model that's used in most cities in the US, I would say. And then there's my low-tech method, which I'm going to talk about now, and which I think is a lot of fun. So basically, from my research, I was working in Mexico in this rural area, and it's a highland environment. And I don't know if you remember my comment towards the beginning of the semester where I said that a lot of techniques from studying highland systems can be used in urban systems. So I'm talking about a rural place, but for many parts of the world, even in the US, I think, this could be an important approach, especially at local levels or in the context of small groups trying to think about potential scenarios or potential actions they can take given increased climatic variability that may occur from climate change. So part of my work was basically this co-investigation or participatory research project that I did with a farmer network in Mexico. The network is called SEDICAM. And the region where I worked has a few, I just want to go briefly over some of the basic characteristics of the region. So Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca, if you look in the upper right corner there, is in black. That's the southern portion of Mexico. And zooming into the territory there, you'll see Oaxaca City, which is the capital. And where I was working was about an hour and a half away from there in the north, in a higher elevation area called the Mixteca Alta. And I worked with 3 communities there. I basically lived with them for 3 years and did all sorts of activities. And this is one of the things that we did was what I'm going to talk about now. They're indigenous farmers who have had land rights there for a very long time. A lot of their governance structures are have been relatively intact. They still have it's a communal land holding structure, so people have the right to farm land, but it's actually owned by the community. And if somebody dies and they don't have any family to pass it along to, it usually goes back into a community pool, where another person could then buy it from the community to be able to have production rights on that land. So it's kind of a cool, unusual in the sense of what we're not used to, kind of community governance structure. I want to just briefly describe the kinds of agroecosystems that exist in the region. So the most traditional form of planting maize is the cajete system, which basically just means box in English. And basically what people do is in the dry season, if you look first, I should probably point out the climatological dynamics in the region. So the rainfall starts in May to June is when it really takes off, and then it kind of ends around October. So from October through April, it's pretty dry in the region. It's considered, they actually call it well, they just call it by the dry season, wet season. Sometimes they'll call it by the summer is the dry season, but it's actually the winter, which gets really confusing. So better to call it just dry, wet. And the temperature corresponds with the rains. So it's a monsoon. It's considered a monsoon climate, whereas it's similar to, maybe I think like India has a similar pattern where they have heat in the summer when the rains come. So to dry farm maize, you plant it between February and April, and before the rains have really started, which means you have to prepare your soils even earlier in November. And the way people plant cajete is in groups, as you can see in the photo there. And basically they work collectively with a digging implement where they carve away the soil and plant the seed wherever there's residual soil moisture. And so that basically allows the seeds to grow without water in those kind of ditches that they make over the dry period until the rains start. Does that make sense? So it's this kind of remnant of pre-Hispanic farming that's still practiced today. Then you have goats and sheep that are a very predominant component to people's livelihoods. They used to be very widespread, and it was like the major industrial product from the region, and they've basically decimated the area completely to where there are huge problems with soil erosion, just incredible issues. But now it's more typically a smaller scale activity done by families. And then finally we have what's called temporal maize, which is what you might traditionally think of in corn production, which is you plant it in May at the beginning of the rainy season, and it grows rain-fed, but starting at the beginning of the rainy season until November or December. Oh, that's my computer doing something weird. Hold on. So just a side note, that program's called FLux, and it dims your screen to correspond with the cycle of the sun, so that when you're working at night, you don't kill your eyes and disrupt your, circadian rhythm? Circadian rhythm. It's kind of neat. but it's hell for presentations. So this will keep you awake longer, I think. Okay. So I talked about that. So in this context that I'm working in, the people do not have access to even formal education in the older generations. And if I were to arrive and talk to them about models and projections and future scenarios, they'd be looking at me with blank stares. So you have to rethink your approach depending on who you're working with. This isn't to say that this would be exclusive to this area. You know, you'll encounter this in the US too, where people outside of the academic world, if you bring them graphs and hard data and all this stuff, they're going to just be completely lost. So it's important to realize this when you start working with communities. And what we wanted to do was kind of recount the history that they remembered of the climatic events in their past and what they had done to prevent the impact of that climatic event, right? Does that make sense? So identify the climatic history followed by the impacts and what adaptation strategy they took to respond to those impacts. So basically, this is what the graphs look like that we created in dialogue, right? So we started with the community history, you know, when the community was founded, when the oldest person in the group was born, when electricity arrived, when fertilizers arrived. From that, we were able to describe key moments in their climate history and what kind of impact those moments had. So you can see there a reduction in cobs and increase in pests in 1990, frost damages, wind damages. And then we got into the more interesting stuff, which is what they actually did about the situation. And I wrote a whole bunch of stuff about what they actually did. So I'm not going to cover it in detail right now. I'm more interested in showing you the structure of how you go about getting this kind of information if it's not already documented. This is a figure that's trying to summarize overall in the three communities what trends are happening based on these descriptions and what farmers are doing in order to deal with climatic variability. So we see that in terms of climate, they told us that the climatic variability is increasing since around the 1990s, and that the growing season is actually getting shorter, which means that we have less time to produce in a more variable climate, which is a lot harder to do. So they're experiencing these challenges climatically that according to them weren't as prevalent 30 or 40 years ago. In terms of labor, we've seen a kind of constant but increasing, I guess, decrease in human labor along with animal husbandry, which has its impacts on a whole host of activities that happen in their communities. So because there aren't as many people in the communities, they're not able to have animals, and because of that, they don't have the fertilizers they need, they don't have the animal traction they need, they don't have the amount of economic return that they used to have. Did you have a question?
Are they using pesticides, those human labor, that comes from the increase in migration that we saw on the last page, and also
Yeah.
because of the smaller growing season and fewer people working?
It has more to do with the first thing you mentioned, which is the increase in migration from the youth. A lot of people are leaving to find jobs in the cities or to migrate to work in other parts of the world. So yeah, this is a pretty common story in Mexico. In this region, there's a joke that the big economic driver right now is labor elsewhere. You know, they're providing labor cheaply to the rest of the world. In terms of inputs, like you were saying, though, they have increased the use of synthetic fertilizers in tractors recently to make up for the losses in human labor in animal manures and things like that. So those have been kind of come into their systems together, kind of joined. And the interventions that SETI-COM, the organization that I worked with, their interventions focused mostly on composting and green manures, as well as soil conservation strategies. We've seen a reduction in cajete maize, an increase in temporal maize, and increasing post-harvest damage with the introduction of these subsidized building materials that change the temperature of where the grains are stored. So a lot of interesting dynamics happening. In terms of the climate histories and what they told us, we then looked at the models, and this is kind of a stepping away from the communities and doing some fun academic stuff on the side. It doesn't really impact them directly, but it's kind of an interesting note that a lot of what the farmers described in terms of climate history is evidenced also in the regional climate records. So we see the graph on the top shows change from, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, I put the explanation of these graphs. Basically, they're comparing 1950 to 1990 with 1990 to 2010 and the differences between those two time periods. So a 40-year period compared with the last 20 years and the differences between them in terms of, so this basically shows positive or negative change, right? So we've seen positive change in temperature every month of the year except for November, and with most change occurring in the summertime, well, the wet season, I should say, when their crops are growing. So that corresponds to what they were saying about temperature. And then in terms of rainfall, we've seen reductions in rainfall in January and July, with slight increases in April, May, August, and August, but they're not very significant. I don't know if that's actually been experienced by the farmers, those early rains. They seem to say that the rains are coming later in the year in general. Basically, I think what's happening is that these drops in June and July are kind of, their signal is outweighing any previous signal, so it still is drier because the change, those were June and July are like the critical months for rainfall, and they're getting a lot less of it. So it's having a huge impact on their crops. This is looking at the relationship between temperature and rainfall for those two time periods, so 1951 to 1990 and 1991 to 2010. And basically what you see is that there's a greater increase in temperature than in rainfall. If you look at the black dots, they're in general higher up than the circles. Okay, and also high rainfall years. Well, let's see. How do I read this? I think that's the main thing that I would want to point out at this point. Anyway, getting back to the communities, though, this is the next stage of the community assessment, which is to say, now we know the history, the climate history, and the impacts of climate on farming. How do we deal with the situation now and in the future? And so what we did was we proposed this assessment tool that farmers could develop and apply in their fields. So they were doing the entire evaluation process from start to finish. And my role was mostly just to kind of facilitate and guide the process, not so much do any analysis of it at all. So basically we got farmers together. We described what conditions meant, whether there's a favorable condition, a normal condition, or a marginal condition. And based on that, we use these facial iconographies to translate this concept into terms that were more easily understood. And based on that, we asked them, what factors influence the productivity of your fields when there's a drought or there's a flood or some sort of climatic event that's out of normal? And from that, they were able to identify numerous characteristics of fields that play a role in that. So we placed them in the landscape scale, management scale, and soil quality realm to kind of make it easier to interpret. The landscape indicators would be those indicators that aren't really directly influenced by one farmer. I mean, there's more of a community impact happening there. It's not one farmer's actions that are impacting those indicators. It takes the whole community. In terms of the management, those are things that the farmer is directly responsible for managing in their field. And then soil quality would be things that are kind of descriptive mostly. They're not directly impacted by farmers' actions, although they might be over the long term. So farmers then, once they identified these indicators, they then described them using language that they understood locally. And so we get these very descriptive things that sometimes people would refer to depths by forearm length rather than centimeters, depended on the community. Farmers mentioned specific trees that had different kinds of impacts in their communities. And then farmers visited fields and did assessments. So I know this is kind of hard to read, but basically on the bottom axis here we have the indicators that the farmers identified. And the two communities are stacked on top of each other. And then the categories of landscape, farmer management, and soil quality go in the vertical direction, okay? And basically this is the sum of their rankings as a group in the entire community, right? So basically the more red you see on or more red or yellow you see on the graph, the worse the condition is, the further it is from optimal. And the more green you see, the more optimal that condition or indicator is. And so what we saw were a few, really high and a really low indicators, and then we saw also trends overall. And this is not something you can analyze much with statistics, I don't think, but just with basic counting and visual observation, you can tell that there's some differences between the categories. So what I see when I look at this is that the landscape indicators as a whole were much lower than either of the other two in the ranking. Yeah? It's subjective ranking, but it's based on descriptions that they came up with and that are relevant to their lives. So in that way, it's not really subjective. It's been defined previously before going into the field. And farmers have, on one hand, the sheet where they're going to record their ranking, and then on the other one, the qualitative description of that characteristic. And so, yes, we did divide it up groups. So we had 4 groups looking at the same field and coming up with their own evaluations. And then we combined all of those responses on a community level. So we actually did, 3 groups, I'm thinking now. 3 groups, 4 fields, and so that's a total of 16 responses for one community. So we try to deal with that subjectivity by incorporating those elements into the design. Yeah?
Have like someone do like a scientific approach, like that's what they would do here, and like compare the two?
That's a good question about whether, no, I didn't want to do any science-based evaluations because I didn't feel that it would be appropriate or accurate enough to do. And I know that's typically the way it's done. You usually triangulate traditional knowledge with scientific knowledge, but I find that a little bit arrogant on the part of science. And I wanted to really just focus on this process and describe it really well rather than try to bridge 2 completely different ways of seeing the world, So I took a little bit more of an anthropological approach to this project because people have suggested that to me before. You're not the first. And it's a good observation that it might have been interesting to do a comparison to what a scientific analysis would be. But the point is not so much whether you can prove something to be a fact or not. It's what people do with that information that they've obtained from the analysis. So I guess the reason I didn't do it, and now that I'm talking about it, I'm getting down to it. In the end, they proposed policies or actions that they could take as a community. And me coming with my scientific analysis, first, it would have taken way too long, and it wouldn't have been ready on time for that process, and it wouldn't have meant anything to them anyway. So because of that, I didn't feel it. I'm not trying to prove that the landscape is more of a problem than than farmer management or soil quality. It's not my place to judge that. This is really a tool for them. And the outcomes, I mean, I think we as scientists can learn from their observations, but I'm not making any claims about the region or, you know, how things are on a more general scale. How did I get involved? I worked in ALBA, which is the Agriculture and Land-Based Training Association, and they work with a lot of farmers in Mexico. And I'd visited Oaxaca previously. So when I came to graduate school at Berkeley, Miguel proposed this project to me, and because of my connection with people from Mexico and because of having visited Oaxaca, I decided it would be interesting to go. So he helped facilitate it because he had contact with SETICOM. They'd been communicating for years. And he was able to get a small amount of funding to start a project between a couple different research institutes and SETICOM. Okay, so anyway, the farmers saw that information and they decided on recommendations to deal with the situation at the different scales. So in terms of landscape, what to do, in terms of farmer management, what to do in terms of soil quality, what were things that they could do and these recommendations would really only apply to their farming systems and their context. Although you could compare them to the more general recommendations of adaptation and mitigation strategies, and they actually do parallel pretty well. So, where's my phone? Anyway, so that's the outcome of the work that we did. We have half an hour, so I'm going to stop and take a few questions. But basically, the idea I had in mind was, what if we divided in groups based on the lab groups, the community project groups, and discussed for our community projects, how would this same methodology be applied? What kinds of indicators might be used to describe their systems? How might they rank them? And what, if you were to imagine doing this evaluation with them, what outcomes might come out of it? So that's what I would propose as an activity in the last 30 minutes. I could also just answer questions about my research, but it's up to you. Maybe we'll do a little bit of both. Are there any questions? Yeah. Yeah. When I graduated from Berkeley, I talked to Miguel. I was already working with Miguel. I talked with him about doing this trip through Latin America and visiting all sorts of agroecology projects to get a sense of what, because I'd heard from him all these stories, and I was really interested in seeing what it was about. So I had to get down to Brazil anyway, and so instead of just flying to Brazil, I took 6 months to travel in Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, Chile. I'm sorry, not Chile. Peru, Bolivia, and then Brazil. So I did this kind of long trip where I visited a whole bunch of different farming projects. So when I was in Oaxaca, I met with Peter Rosset. It was only a brief stop between visiting the Zapatistas in Chiapas and then going up to Mexico City to work with a couple of researchers up there. But it was pretty impactful, and I thought it would be interesting to go back. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a really good point. An outcome of this process that I didn't mention yet to you guys was that they actually recognized that they weren't going to be able to achieve the landscape level issues just alone by farmer to farmer. They'd have to work together as a group. And so they actually formed working groups and continued to discuss the recommendations that they'd come up with. And then the organization SETICOM actually started what's called like a field school or an agricultural school, where they started training community members to do conservation work. Like the issue with erosion is just awful. And so they basically they were doing this training to teach farmers how to implement conservation practices and restore degraded fields. And that project was a 3-year project that was just starting when I was doing this. So a lot of the same people that were involved in these workshops ended up in that school.
So, what, like, through this process, how did they identify, like, specific measures that they could take to improve the situation? Can you give us, like, examples of what kind of strategies did they actually use to improve the conditions of their?
I don't know if they actually implemented any specific one, but if we go back to these, they're definitely building conservation on the lands in the level of the community. You know, they're building contour bunds, which are just basically ditches on contour with a little bit of a pile of soil on the downslope side, which basically traps water and helps it infiltrate into the soil. Since we're working in mountainous areas, that's really important. And so that's definitely happening. The livestock issue is, I'm not sure whether they're addressing that, but that was a really big issue. So basically, they can't establish any perennial vegetation on their borders, the borders of their fields, because of the livestock grazing that happens there. And so it's like kind of an incompatible situation where you either have livestock or you have fruit trees and perennial vegetation. So that was an issue that was really important, but I don't know if they did anything about it or not. I'm thinking they probably did, but in a kind of slow and steady kind of way. And then these other things, the manure and composts, some of these things they probably are doing and some of them are not. Like, I know a lot of communities are using tractor cultivation now, and that's not because they don't, it's partly because it's more time efficient, but it's also because they don't have the youth anymore there to plow the fields with the Egyptian plow. And they have to go work in the off season, so they're not around to cultivate the soil in the winter, or in the dry season, I should say. So those are things that can't be implemented, you know, even though people might want to.
Does anybody like look at their communal like land use practices?
Yeah, the communal land use practices. Yeah, I mean, there's so much on that, and I mean, I can't. I'm not studying that per se, but it is. There's been a lot of work done on the Mixteca Alta region and how, you know, the communal land holding structure, decision making. There are all sorts of really cool traditions that sociologists and anthropologists have described. You know, like the Getza and the I forget the other one. Anyway, there are these voluntary kind of community. There are two levels of reciprocity that occur in communities. One is between families, and the other one is on the level of the community. And so for some periods of time, they've kind of abandoned those, some of them, but it's starting to come back. And it's been described by a lot of researchers. Yeah. So I guess, okay, why don't we try to summarize some of the main points, because there's a lot of different ideas that I presented. So we're talking about planning, right? And in order to plan, you need to have some sort of reference point. Whether that reference point be some sort of future projection and mapping, or past experiences that you can build off of, given just an assumption of more variability in climate, right? And from there you end up with doing some sort of evaluation, whether it's at the landscape through a GIS lens, or whether it's by evaluating on the ground what's actually happening. And then you come out with recommendations and policy actions that can happen. And so, of course, my ability to impact the way that farmers do things, or the actual things that happen after I leave, is very limited. Whereas if some of these policies were incorporated by people working in nonprofits, or, you know, local governments or things of that nature, there might be the opportunity for more inclusion into more formal policy decision making, right? And so, like I said at the beginning, a lot of that high technology approach is used in the climate plans already being implemented all across California. So if you have the opportunity and an interest, you can probably ask Jesse Arreguin. I mean, it's probably available on the internet, but we're going to have a panel about urban agriculture for cities, and part of that is thinking about climate. And so if you remember Miguel's lecture from the very first day, he talked about the example of Cuba. And in there, the disturbance wasn't environmental, it was a political disturbance. But basically, the collapse of the Soviet bloc in 1989 cut off all the subsidies to agriculture in Cuba, which collapsed the entire production system of the nation. And the way that the Cubans dealt with that was by starting urban farms that were able to provide vegetables, and at least vegetables, to the urban populations. And then there were other actions that were taken in the rural environments too, like cooperatives and that sort of thing. So I'm just trying to frame what I just talked about in that context, and then where we're going from here with the next couple of lectures, talking about how agriculture actually fits into such plans for dealing with climate change or other issues. Okay? So we're now down to 20 minutes. So how about you all getting together with your groups and come up with 5 indicators that would describe your communities, and then we'll do a quick round of sharing of what those would be. Sure.